You're listening to Part 4 of The Disappearance of Belinda Van Lith.
She was very outgoing. She was very beautiful always. She was a very popular girl, very athletic, and she loved gardening. She had it made at home. She had nothing to run away from.
If they were doing stuff like that, more people should have known, because
The family should have known first.
I firmly believe that the more people that know information, somebody saw something somewhere, and whether it was a critical piece of information, it might have led to a critical piece of information.
I do stupid things when I was younger, yeah. Did I understand why I was doing them? No.
Did you kill Belinda? Did you kidnap her or have anything to do with her going missing? It was January of 2002. Belinda's case had been cold for roughly a decade when investigators in Wright County got a call. A woman said her sister overheard information about a confession in the Van Lith case. Okay, now bear with me. This part is convoluted. Her sister was riding in the back of a truck driven by their aunt in either 2000 or 2001. Their mom was the passenger. The tipster's sister told her that she overheard their aunt telling their mom a story about Belinda's distant cousin who went to their aunt's house at some point in the 1980s and said he and a friend took Belinda. Now, this could have been a big tip, an alleged confession by someone who knew the victim, Belinda. So investigators followed up. They called the aunt, and we'll call her Carol, who was living in the Chicago area at the time. Her recollection of the timeline of events was vague. She first thought that maybe the confession came at some time between 1983 and 1989, when that distant cousin came over in a drunken stupor and told her he and a friend had taken Belinda. Then, the more she thought about it, she narrowed down the dates to at some point between 1987 and 1989. Her memory was as follows. This cousin, we'll call him Ronald, was with a friend on a dark and foggy night. They were driving through Wright County back roads when they saw Belinda walking. They offered her a ride and she declined, but they spent some time talking with her before forcing her into the car. The next thing Ronald remembered was sitting on a gravestone drinking beer. Belinda then fell into an open grave. Again, this is all according to Ronald's drunken confession. He said things got out of hand, but he didn't recall how. And then he said he woke up dirty and bloody in his friend's car. Carol told investigators that Ronald regularly showed up at her house in this state. She tried to ask him follow-up questions, but he was too intoxicated to respond. By the time the confession came in, it was old. It had been passed down and around for decades. Yet investigators took it seriously. They considered Ronald a suspect. They interviewed ex-wives, close acquaintances, family members, and they interviewed Ronald, who adamantly denied any involvement in Belinda's disappearance. Investigators also tried to wiretap conversations between Ronald and Carol. They figured once Ronald knew he was being investigated because of things he allegedly said to Carol, that he'd call her, and that conversation would be revealing. But Illinois is a two-party consent state, which means both parties have to agree to being recorded. Minnesota is a one-party consent state, which means only one person has to agree to it. Investigators also tracked down records from cemeteries in and near the area where Belinda went missing. They were looking for records of any open grave sites at the time, but there weren't any. When I read this part of the report, two things stood out to me. Ronald said they took Belinda when she was walking down the road on a dark and foggy night, but Belinda likely went missing during the late morning or early afternoon of June 15, 1974. Remember, her friend Debbie was the last person to talk to her on the phone. And then she didn't show up to her sister's going away party in the afternoon, a party she wouldn't miss. So that was one part of the story that didn't add up. The other part that stood out was the idea that Belinda was walking down a back road at night without her belongings. Remember, all of Belinda's core belongings were left behind. Her wallet, ID, money, and class ring, which I recently learned from Debbie was a piece of jewelry she never left behind.
Because all I ever heard was that a sheet was missing, but her purse and everything was still there. And it's awful strange because Belinda never took her class ring off, ever. And I heard that that was left behind also.
Investigators also talked to Belinda's mother, Beverly Van Lith, to ask her about allegations that she had confronted Ronald and told him to go to hell, presumably because of his involvement with Belinda's disappearance. Beverly, it turned out, had not confronted the cousin and never told him to go to hell. When Belinda's siblings obtained the investigative file related to her case, they were shocked to learn that their cousin had been a suspect in their sister's disappearance. It was news to them. Investigators exhausted all the leads that came from that alleged confession. In the end, it was determined that it just wasn't credible. But Ronald wasn't the only suspect investigators honed in on. Dwayne Cornwell, who owned the home Belinda was house-sitting when she went missing, was initially dismissed as a suspect. As you'll recall from part 1 of this series, deputies ruled him out as a suspect early on, after they checked in with the hotel he was staying at in Nashville. There was a discrepancy in his story, though. He said he checked out with his bandmate on June 14th, and the hotel could only confirm he stayed there until June 13th. Years later, though, investigators put him back on their radar after he told officials in November of 1989 that he kidnapped Jacob Wetterling and buried him under the dog kennel in his yard. Okay, at this point, you might be thinking, what? If you're from Minnesota or the surrounding states, you'll recall that Jacob Wetterling was an 11-year-old boy who went missing in October of 1989 from Stearns County, which borders Wright County. His case remained unsolved for 27 years until a confession by Danny Heinrich led investigators to his remains, located near his abduction site. We know now that Dwayne Cornwell did not commit that crime. Investigators, even back then, didn't entirely believe it either. Dwayne was in a state of severe mental illness when he made that confession. It came after he told law enforcement that he knew where Jacob was buried. The task force dedicated to the Wetterling case responded. They surrounded his house, which was then in Stearns County, and eventually, Dwayne came out and led investigators on a wild goose chase throughout the county, looking for the area where he said Jacob had been buried. Dwayne was acting erratic during the drive, so they returned to his home, where he told investigators in a state of hysteria that he took Jacob and buried him on his property. Dwayne was arrested and taken into the station. From there, he was sent to a nearby hospital for psychiatric treatment. Investigators did follow through, though. They executed a search warrant on Dwayne's residence, and 5 months later, after he had received treatment and medication, BCA agent Dennis Sigafus, who you'll recall from part 3 of this series, talked to him about Jacob's case. At that point, he denied any involvement. Sigafus didn't just ask Dwayne about Jacob, though. He also brought up Belinda. Dwayne denied having anything to do with Belinda's disappearance. He recounted his trip to Nashville. He recalled pulling into his driveway shortly after his mother arrived. He told investigators how he and his mother looked for Belinda throughout the house, but realized she wasn't there. Dwayne told investigators that he hired Belinda to watch the house because he was afraid his ex-wife would steal his property if someone wasn't there. He also recalled telling a close friend that he believed one of his ex-wives could have killed Belinda out of jealousy. Sigafus talked to Dwayne's ex-wives. There were 3 of them. They all reported his issues with alcohol, mental health, and physical violence. All of the stories sounded rather familiar. He would get drunk and violent, and sometimes sexually violent. Here's something interesting about this part of the report. Those portions of the investigative file that we just talked about were filed and conducted with the BCA and Stearns County Sheriff's Office, not Wright County. It's not clear when these files were handed over to Wright County, but they are now part of Belinda's investigative file. And they were referenced during the 2008 cold case review of Belinda's disappearance, which we'll get to. Back to Dwayne. One of his ex-wives was documented in those reports, saying something that must have stood out to Wright County Sheriff's investigators when they were looking over the case file from Stearns County. She told the BCA investigator that while Dwayne was hospitalized, he allegedly mentioned a shallow grave under a shed. His ex-wife believed he could have been referencing Belinda's whereabouts. Now, fast forward to 2008, the next big year for Belinda's case. That was the year Wright County Sheriff's Office investigators filled out a BCA cold case card application for Belinda's disappearance. Essentially, they were requesting that the BCA include Belinda's photo on a deck of cards that they were going to release featuring cold cases from around the state. The idea was that it would be a good way to get the public involved because who turns down a deck of cards? As part of the application, officials with the Wright County Sheriff's Office had to provide details regarding the case. And they did, most of which we've already covered. She went missing on June 15th, 1974, from Dwayne's residence. There were no signs of a struggle. She left her wallet and personal belongings behind. The last person to talk to her was her friend, Debbie, the morning of June 15th. The last person to see her was Timothy Crosby on June 14th. He was staying alone in a cabin 100 yards from Belinda. He got his car stuck in a manure pile that evening and was absent through the day and night. And 6 months later, he, Timothy Crosby, kidnapped and raped a woman at his cabin. Belinda's body has not yet been located. Detective Dave Clements filed that report, and I can only imagine that application was the fuel for what came next. Months later, a cold case review into Belinda's disappearance was launched by the Wright County Sheriff's Office in conjunction with the BCA. And investigators honed in on Dwayne's former residence. I recently went out to Eagle Lake with Belinda's siblings, Cindy, Wendy, and Scott. They showed me around the area, including the farm where they grew up. And as you can hear Cindy say here, it's quite close to Dwayne's former home.
So from where you're standing right here, you can see the Cornwall house. See right through the woods. If you follow my hand right through, you can see just a little bit of reddish color. Just straight. You can see a roof line.
Dwayne moved out not too long after Belinda went missing. Thomas Grew purchased Dwayne's home in 1975. He learned early on that Belinda had gone missing from the residence. Not too long after his purchase, investigators came knocking on his door.
So, yeah, when we bought the place, we found out about the situation of Belinda, and then we had investigators who were trying to follow up and find out, and they came out and several times done a walkthrough of the property.
Then, more than 30 years later, another set of investigators knocked on his door, asking him questions about Belinda. In July of 2009, Thomas Grew showed Wright County Sheriff's Office investigators around his property.
Then later on, maybe 10 years ago, again they came out and dug up, one of the properties down by the lake and looked at our place. And
he filled them in on improvements he made on the home over the years. One was in addition to the south side, which included the construction of a basement. During that project, which required extensive digging, there were no items found that he or family members thought were related to Belinda's case. He also made other improvements to the property. He landscaped the yard and updated the big red barn. And he changed the outdoor power pole source, which had been located 40 feet from the house when he first moved in. The dirt floor shed remained the same, though. In 2013, a team of investigators led by Wright County Sheriff's Office Lieutenant Mike Lindquist with the Criminal Investigations Division dug up the area in and around that shed, based on the tip from Dwayne's ex-wife that had come in decades earlier through Stearns County. During the search, investigators dug down 3 feet. On the top layer of the dirt floor, they discovered a small, multicolored beaded necklace. It should be noted, though, that Grew did have daughters who grew up on the property. By observing it, the necklace looks like it came from a more recent time than the 1970s. They also discovered a small animal bone and remnants of an old cloth item with a clasp. And that was that. It was the final part of their investigation into Dwayne's possible involvement in Belinda's disappearance. From there, they focused their investigation solely on Timothy Crosby. And that investigation required a lot of work. Lieutenant Lindquist led a full-scale investigation into Timothy Crosby's possible involvement in Belinda's disappearance and the 2 women whose dismembered remains were discovered near Eagle Lake in the early 1990s. One part of that investigation was a search of the Crosby cabin, which had since been purchased by a new owner. That owner, though, mentioned there were some belongings left behind in the basement by the Crosbys, including a sickle and a metal angle iron that had visible signs of blood. You've been listening to The Vault, a Forum Communications podcast covering true crime in the Upper Midwest. This series is dedicated to the disappearance of Belinda Van Lith and the investigation that followed. To see documents from the case file and images of Belinda, Timothy Crosby, and others in this series, visit inforum.com/Belinda. This series is written, narrated, and produced by me, Trisha Turinskis. The Vault's editor is Jeremy Fugelberg. If you have any information related to this case, please reach out. You can find my email in the show notes. Thank you for listening.